Whiplash is a movie that I watched for the first time this year. It is one that had either been mentioned or referenced by YouTubers I watch, and I finally got around to checking it out. My experience watching the film was similar to when I watched The Lighthouse for the first time. It was a rush of a lot of emotions that was enhanced by me making the mistake of drinking a monster before I watched it. Unlike The Lighthouse, I didn't want to make a whole review of it, but instead I wanted to focus on an aspect that intrigued me. But I didn't want to do it alone, so I brought along Hayden from Hayden's Entertainment Hour to help me out. Why don't you introduce yourself?
Well, Dalton, I will say, you're dragging just a hair. Come on, let's take it from the top.
Unlike that Lighthouse, I didn't want to make a whole review of it, but instead I wanted to focus on an aspect that intrigued me.
But in all seriousness, my name is Hayden, and I met Dalton through a mutual server a few years ago. I started off by casually doing a podcast called Hayden's Entertainment Hour, where I talked with my co-host Brian about recent movies that hit theaters. However, Dalton reached out to me one day to talk about Soul and Wonder Woman 84 on the podcast, and from there we have both grown to since talk about our passion for film and what brought us to film individually. So much so that today we are going to try to dissect the madman that is Terrance Fletcher, and how he stands out from other mentor characters in film.
Andrew Neiman is a freshman at Schaefer Conservatory who is offered a chance to perform in the conservatory's studio band by its conductor and band leader, Terrance Fletcher. However, he quickly finds out that he's bitten off more than he can chew, as Fletcher turns out to be a degrading and abusive instructor.
Over the course of the film, Neiman is constantly pushed to be a perfectionist, but it's at the cost of his relationships with his dad, his girlfriend, and his relatives. It all comes to a head when he is pushed too far and snaps, and attacks Fletcher in retaliation for the psychological torment he had to endure.
After Neiman is expelled, he's coaxed into assisting a family in building a case against Fletcher, as their son was a former student who committed suicide because of the effect that he had on him. Later on in the film, Neiman seeks out Fletcher in a jazz club, where the two seemingly reconcile, with the former bandleader inviting him to perform with him at the Newport Jazz Festival.
However, it's a trap! And Fletcher uses it as an opportunity to humiliate Neiman by not giving him the sheet music for the song they perform, causing him to make an ass of himself on stage in front of hundreds of prominent industry figures. After he initially runs off stage to be comforted by his father, Neiman ultimately returns to the stage and performs Caravan, the same song he was forced to play for hundreds of hours as one of Fletcher's students.
Though he is at first taken aback by these actions, Fletcher ultimately goes along with it, and finally gives Neiman the approval he was looking for the whole film, with the movie ending on the final note of their performance.
What makes Whiplash such a rewatchable film after all these years is not only J.K. Simmons' infectiously fun performance as Fletcher, but also the way Damien Chazelle crafts his narrative with distinct choices. Chazelle has often noted that Terrance Fletcher as a character is someone who tries to find the superhuman in everyone. Because he is so perfect at the way he performs, he expects every single human being to be just as perfect as him. Fletcher has a perfect version of the music he produces in his head, but his roadblock is getting human beings to perform this perfect version for him. So much so to the point in which he begins to gaslight, abuse, and embarrass his students to their breaking point.
You are a worthless, friendless, faggot-lipped little piece of shit whose mommy left daddy when she figured out he wasn't Eugene O'Neill, and who is now weeping and slobbering all over my drum set like a fucking 9-year-old girl.
Only in this does he feel will it bring out their inner spark and create the superhumans he's looking for. Take, for example, the scene in which Fletcher is trying to spot who is out of tune in his band. Fletcher knows from the first beat which student is out of tune, yet decides to pick on a student who has very little self-esteem to stick up for themselves. As a result, Fletcher manages to bully the student out of the class.
For the record, Metz wasn't out of tune. You were, Erickson. But he didn't know, and that's bad enough.
He's an asshole.
This moment signifies to the audience Fletcher is not going to be some average generic mentor character who will teach, positively reinforce, and accept human error. Instead, Fletcher is shown to the audience as a mentor who believes only pushing his students to the brink may bring out the superhuman ability he wants in his jazz band. And if they don't, well, they can go take awful photos for the Daily Bugle.
Compare this to Neiman's previous teacher, Mr. Kramer. No, not you. There are a handful of scenes before he joins the studio band where we see Kramer's class performing music, and it's clear that he doesn't seem to care that much about the quality of the performance that his students give. This is contrasted with the first studio band rehearsal we see, where Neiman making a slight mistake causes Fletcher to move in for the kill. In a movie with a more positive version of a mentor figure, the mentor might be more encouraging and have a much kinder way of bringing out the best in people. For example, Obi-Wan Kenobi goes at Luke's pace and is encouraging to him even though he struggles a lot. Fletcher went to the Omni-Man school of mentorship. So there's no way in hell that he is going to use any tact with his methods. Another film that uses a hard-ass mentor figure is, ironically, the film where Jack Black plays a panda that crushes a villain with his thick ass.
Everybody was kung fu fighting!
Master Shifu from Kung Fu Panda was a perfectionist, much like how Fletcher perceived his world. The Furious Five were all top-notch, skilled warriors with very little flaws between each of them. His idea of perfection was disciplined warriors with a keen eye for respecting the martial arts and balancing their skills with a sharp mind. But when Jack Black comes rockin' and rollin' into Shifu's life, he becomes frustrated as to how the universe ever chose Po to be the Dragon Warrior.
What?
Po is stupid, clumsy, has no real fighting skills, and often just annoys Shifu to death. So much so, to the point in which Shifu begs Oogway into reconsidering his decision while manipulating Po into quitting. It isn't until after Oogway's passing that Shifu begins to discover that Po has more talents than meets the eye. Po's backwards method of using his weight, stupidity, and even his amateur fighting skills make him the most distinctly unique warrior he's ever trained. When Tai Lung escapes from prison, he is already well equipped in knowledge of how to defeat each of the Furious Five. But because of Po's unnatural skills, he is unable to find a way to best Po and is defeated by a simple whooshy finger hold.
You should have gone for the head.
By the end of the film, Shifu begins to discover Po truly has an inner spark that had to be realized in how he naturally perceived things, rather than in trying to force Po to be a perfect martial arts fighter, like his other students.
Fletcher, of course, goes through almost a similar arc such as Shifu, but his reasoning as to why can be seen as somewhat admirable. While this shouldn't excuse Fletcher for any of his terrible actions in the film, it does show why he was such a damn perfectionist all the way. Fletcher knows that Neiman is responsible for making him lose his job, which only fills Fletcher with a blinding rage to embarrass Neiman on the biggest stage of his career to ensure he was right about Neiman never having the spark he was chasing.
I guess maybe you don't have it.
The film makes you think after Neiman is embarrassed on stage, the movie is going to end with him walking away from jazz entirely. Only for it to subvert this moment, and Neiman, using his own methods, begins to orchestrate the band to play on his own rhythm and time. This upstaging at first rages Fletcher, but as Caravan slowly begins to play out, Neiman begins to unleash the spark he had deep down. So much so to the point in which Neiman enters his own The Zone from Soul and plays a perfect tempo. The same tempo Fletcher, after all this time, was searching for. Instead of tormenting Neiman, Fletcher instead sits back and encourages Neiman to play out this moment.
Andrew, what are you doing, man?
The last shot we get is a shot of Fletcher's eyes and his upper lip muscles moving to say something to Neiman. While many perceive this as the good job statement Fletcher talks about early on in the film,
There are no two words in the English language more harmful than good job.
many can see it as an ambiguous ending that leaves us with many questions about many things. What does Fletcher do after the concert? Does Neiman become like the other student who committed suicide? Did Fletcher's demoralizing mentoring methods actually help Neiman? And I think that's ultimately the point. Chazelle wants us to feel this ambiguity in the moment and decide our own perception of how Fletcher may feel and what becomes of Neiman.
Ultimately, after it's all said and done, many can conclude Fletcher's mentorship does not leave a positive impact on any of his students' lives. His drive for perfection not only leads to many students leaving the world of jazz entirely, but also almost ruins Neiman's life and his relationship with his family.
If Neiman is killed in the car crash scene, it would only prove to the audience that Fletcher is a monster whose own narcissism and drive destroys the psyche of others, the opposite of what a mentor is supposed to do.
That is why, at the end of the day, the audience is not to look at Fletcher as a heroic mentor. They are instead supposed to look at him as a mentor consumed by his own narcissism and drive.
He almost shapes Neiman into becoming just like him. No real friends, quick temper, gaslighting others, and harming himself in the process. Whiplash serves as a warning to not worship mentors who act and think like this.
Ultimately, I think that's the reason why so many of us crawl back to this work from Chazelle. To remind ourselves not to push ourselves into a hole we can't climb out of, but instead to defy these types of mentors and find our own way of happiness and success.